Well, good day, everyone, from whatever time zone you are connecting to this webinar. We're happy to have you here for this special event with Mike Pears. And as we get started, just like to let you know that if you are connecting by today's webinar, we will be putting up information later in the webcast regarding continuing education units if that is of interest to you. But right now I want to turn our attention to the presenter and would like to introduce you to Mike Pears. Mike is this handsome gentleman on to my left is the coordinator of Urban Life, a new center for mission in deprived urban communities, and that is just launching in this year, May of 2014. Mike, with his wife and family, has lived and ministered in urban situations for over 30 years. So that is quite an experience that he brings to this presentation. Much of Mike's time has been spent in deprived estates where he has worked to facilitate creative approaches to incarnational mission and church planting. Mike also works as a tutor at Bristol Baptist College and also is the facilitator for Urban Expression UK and in partnership with the Baptist Association in Bristol. He is currently completing his doctoral degree in mission in urban deprivation. And so, Mike, it has been a pleasure to get to know you in the time that we've been able to spend together preparing for this event, and so it's a real pleasure to have you as a presenter for today's webinar on urban life, networking for mission in marginal places. So we invite you to come and share with us. Thank you.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. Greetings from Bristol, and thank you for joining us this evening. And thanks, Dan, for your introduction there, and also, a really warm thanks to Dan and Enton and the Church of the Brethren for hosting the webinar. This is the first of two webinars that mark the launch of Urban Life. Urban Life is concerned with training and education and research for those involved in embedded and incarnational approaches to mission in marginal places. And these two seminars are appetizers for some of the themes that we will be exploring in more depth through our training and research networks. And I've got to get used to doing the PowerPoint as I speak. So 1 second, bear with me. I've lost my, there we go. Okay, get used to doing the slide. Yeah, this is the first of two webinars, and so we're hoping I'm hoping this will be a kind of appetizer to some of the stuff that we will be doing with Urban Life. And Urban Life is to do with focusing on marginal and deprived communities, training teams in those contexts, and also doing some research. And there will be the web address that you have there at the bottom of your screen. So this seminar explores the theme of marginalization or exclusion. And I want to start with this theme this evening because it's an important part of both our own experience as an intentional Christian community here in South Bristol, and also, I think, for many of the teams that we associate with. Our experience shows us that poverty and marginalization are far from simple or straightforward to understand, and that there are no easy or simple mission responses for marginalized communities. So in this seminar, I want to outline a few key theological perspectives which come out of our own research and experience. My presentation will be in three parts. So marginalization and poverty, marginalization and power, and then we'll think about marginalization and mission towards the end. So starting with a theme of marginalization and poverty. Two questions. What is marginalization and why talk about it? In ministry and mission, we often talk about the poor, and I want to use the term marginalization or exclusion to argue that there are some important areas that mission should address that the simple term the poor does not draw to our attention. In other words, I want to make a distinction between what we normally think of as poverty, that is economic poverty and not having enough to live on, and marginalisation or exclusion. I also want to argue that marginalisation is a helpful way of understanding what the New Testament means when it talks about the poor. The challenge about how to talk about the poor is seen, for example, for us here in the UK, in the ways which we as churches approach the running of food banks in relation to mission. It raises the question, which we've been exploring here in Bristol: should mission include opening a food bank to provide food for those in poverty, or should mission address the structures in society that allow food poverty to exist in a prosperous Western economy like our own? So let's start the conversation by considering Luke's Gospel. We're familiar with the fact that Luke's mission statement, drawing on Isaiah, focuses strongly on good news to the poor. That's chapter 4. This is the first of 6 passages where the word poor is used in association with other adjectives, which have the effect of expanding Luke's understanding of the poor. So we have words here like the captive, blind, oppressed, the hungry, the mournful, the persecuted, the blind, the lame, the leper, the deaf, the dead, they're very poor, the poor, the maimed, and the lame, the blind, etc., the ulcerated and the hungry. The first thing I think we can observe in the way that Luke speaks about poverty is that for him, poverty encompasses a broad sense of deprivation, including disability, homelessness, hunger, illness, and destitution. However, I believe that what we see in Luke's Gospel is more than a sense of poverty as multiple deprivation. There's a clear expression that those who are deprived are also excluded or marginalized. What I mean by this is that people who are often seen as poor find themselves on the outside of things. They are unable to access the kinds of places and social benefits that the more privileged inhabit, and they are often viewed in these prosperous circles with suspicion or fear. They are sometimes seen as unclean and uneducated. And I will argue that this marginalization happens in 2 related ways, which I will find on my PowerPoint here. First of all, social marginalization, and then secondly, and relatedly, physical marginalization. So therefore, I'm suggesting that marginalization means to be, or poverty means to be socially and physically excluded from society's centers of power, and the result is to suffer deprivation. Let's consider, for example, the stories in Luke chapter 18 or 19. Sorry, I should have perhaps warned you to have a Bible with you. If you've got one handy, then you might like to look these stories up as we talk through them. Here we see a string of 6 related stories culminating in the Zacchaeus story, which is the last encounter, narrated in Luke before the narrative of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. So we see here 5 particular stories. The widow, the tax collector in the temple, children who want to come to Jesus, the blind beggar, and then in chapter 19 we see the story of Zacchaeus himself. What we see in Luke 18 and 19 are 5 different characters who represent Luke's poor. They are all, but they are all not economically poor. At least one of them, Zacchaeus, and probably the tax collector in the temple, has a lot of money. So in chapter 19 verse 2 it says of Zacchaeus, he was rich. However, we see 2 characteristics that these 5 people all share. One is that they are socially excluded. The other is that they are physically excluded. So let's look at the ways that works. Let me shift my PowerPoint here. So we see that the widow, the first story, the widow is excluded from justice. The tax collector in the temple is excluded from righteousness. The children are excluded from the blessing of God. The blind beggar is excluded from normal society. He's told to keep quiet. And Zacchaeus himself is excluded from community. He's small in stature. He's at the back of the crowd. He has to climb a tree. All of these were profoundly excluded from the things that we consider fundamental for normal human living and well-being. They were considered unclean, unworthy, alien, and in some cases less than human. Basically, they were impure people who did not belong. So that's a kind of background to social exclusion. In terms of physical exclusion, notice that they were all at a distance physically. This is not made explicit with the widow, but it's pretty clear for her and for the others as well. Let me just show you the PowerPoint for that. So the tax collector in the temple, it said that he stood some distance away and was unwilling to lift his eyes. The children were kept back by the disciples. The blind beggar was far off, which is implied through the phrase that when he came near, and Zacchaeus himself was unable to see because of the crowd which he was at the back of. So each of these 5 people are socially and physically marginalized. Economic poverty is an important aspect of this marginalization, but it is not the only aspect, neither is it, I suggest, the defining aspect. We see in Luke 3 distinct aspects of marginalization. Therefore, we see deprivation or poverty, we see social exclusion, and we see physical exclusion. I'm using the term marginalization to describe the way that these 3 act together. That is, people who are deprived are also always socially and physically excluded. And critically, what they are excluded from are the centers of power. So let me give you a few examples of maybe how we see this in our own particular contexts. Think about, for example, of homeless people. Some while ago, a friend, whilst visiting a city somewhere in the world, I won't say where, saw the police rounding up people in the suburb that he was staying in and putting them onto a bus. When he asked his hosts what was happening, they told him that they were taking these so-called vagrants back to the downtown area. The clear perception is that these people did not belong in the well-to-do suburbs, but should be contained in their own place. Now, similar things happen, of course, here in the UK, especially in rural areas. Another example we see here in Bristol, and certainly it's happening across the south of our country in cities, is the displacement of the poor through gentrification. So when places get a kind of a lift effect socially and economically. So a trend we're seeing here in UK cities is that less wealthy people are being displaced from parts of the city that are becoming desirable, and they're being pushed out to the geographical and social margins of the city. People who are therefore already on low wages, like cleaners, bus drivers, cooks, ministers perhaps, can no longer afford to live in large parts of the city and find themselves living further from places of work, with the result that generally they have to pay more to get to work. They have to longer days because they have to spend a considerable amount of time travelling to and from work. They have less access to good facilities, including education and affordable fresh food. So there's a real sense in our own cities that poorer people are being physically and socially marginalised, and the result of that is that they are also suffering further deprivation. Another interesting way we see people excluded is sometimes in shopping malls. In fact, I was thrown out of a shopping mall yesterday in Bank in the centre of London, but this often happens to groups of young people who they find themselves excluded. And one youth worker I was speaking to some time ago told me when I was talking on this subject that when he took a group of young people from his church to the Bullring, which is a shopping centre in Birmingham, They stopped for refreshments at lunchtime, and they were, in the period of 30 minutes, approached 3 times by security guards and police and asked to move on. Groups of young people often find themselves not welcome and find that society can work to keep them out of places. So I'm going to stop for a quick discussion break. I don't know if there's questions and things coming up, but before I do that, I'll mention that you will have noticed that I've not mentioned the major character who occurs in the middle of Luke's narrative of 6 people, which is the rich young ruler. And I want to come back to him in a moment, but first we stop for a quick discussion break and see if there's any questions or comments so far.
As they say, start your microphone. One of the things that I've noticed as you had the exclusions up there, what do you sense are some of the key fears? What are some of the spiritual, psychological, emotional factors that seem to be playing into these communities as to why people are being excluded?
Well, I think that there are in all parts of society often real fears about people who are different. People who are from different backgrounds, maybe different class backgrounds or different ethnic backgrounds. And one of the things that I've observed is a lot of the life of our cities, although we call them multicultural, they're actually arranged in ways that help us to avoid people who are quite different. And the examples I've mentioned are a couple of those. But you'll notice that, for example, as I've talked to people say they would take certain routes to work, to and from work, or avoid certain areas of the city. And we find ourselves, I think, often cultivating habits which mean that we don't have to encounter people who are very different. I think that kind of discomfort often is reflected when we find ourselves faced with someone who's begging on the street. If we're typically out for a nice day out or something like that, and we're walking up a high street and find someone begging, there's a kind of I think for myself certainly, but for many others, quite an acute sense of discomfort, because that's somebody who's out of place and I'm not really geared to deal with that at that particular time. So I think there's a kind of inherent sense of anxiety about people of difference. And the way that urban life works is often we don't get the opportunity to really encounter people in a way which makes real connections. And I want to go and talk about that a little bit later on in terms of how we might engage in mission. But I don't know if there's other people who've got comments that they'd like to make about that particular question.
Gordon McDade comment said, "We are largely blind to the marginalized. How do we notice them?" And then also Eleanor adds, she says, the same factors are happening even in a small coastal town. And I think also we want to recognize that many of us that are attending here are coming from different parts of are representing different parts of the globe. We're in different kind of contexts. So speak to that, Mike. How can we notice people that are marginalized, or perhaps something you want to do later on as well?
Yep. Well, that is a really critical question. I came across a little phrase from a well-known author yesterday. I can't remember his name offhand, but he said, all of us look, or many of us look, but few of us see. And I think that we get into ways of looking, but find it difficult to see beneath the surface of what is really going on. And I think one of the key challenges for the church, and I think it's a prophetic challenge, is to get under the surface of what we're very familiar with, whether it is in the rural or whether it's in urban areas, and see what really is going on. And I think what I want to argue in a moment, and this will be a subject for our next seminar as well, is about what are the disciplines, what are the spiritual disciplines, and what are the missional disciplines and practices that might help us to open our eyes and understand more deeply what's going on in the places around us. It seems to me this is critical for good engagement. It's critical for crossing boundaries to connect with people of difference, and it's critical as well for Christian community formation. So I think one of the subjects want to explore in our next webinar, which I think is happening in about 3 weeks' time, is coming under the phrase incarnational research methods, but really it's about how do we develop communities which might see more deeply. and connect with people of difference, therefore, more easily. I think on the question of where marginalization happens, yes, definitely, it's you can look at in rural places or towns or cities, marginalization happen and exclusion happen in all of these places, and certainly if you look at the UK, there's a long history of deprivation and marginalization in, for example, our coastal towns, where you have communities there that really struggle and have struggled historically. So I don't want to represent this as just coming from urban areas, and there are some very strongly shared characteristics, I think, between towns, villages, and urban centres.
Yeah, I think sometimes we make a lot of assumptions, especially in rural areas, about people that are marginalized because well, it's the assumption that we make about that context. Just the last question before I turn it back over to you for a presentation. Jenny asked, would you also think that elderly can be marginalized?
Yes, definitely. I think it's really interesting to look at the groups of people that maybe are around us, and I'm certainly aware here on our estate that the elderly are often overlooked, and in terms of development of policy and those kind of things, they're not participating so well in those conversations. So yes, often an overlooked group, as are those with disabilities, particularly with mental health issues. And so there's some areas that really are very much everyday, people we see around us every day, maybe our neighbours, but we're very used to them being around, and we fail really to see how excluded they are. And I think I'm going to argue in a moment that that's partly what Luke was saying through these passages, and that mission is to engage with people who are marginalised and excluded in those kinds of ways.
I'm going to turn the presentation back over to you, Mike, but there is a question. People want to know, what did you do to get Chuck out of the shopping mall?
I have a little video of it, actually. I was with a friend, and we were wandering around Bank. We were doing some kind of exploring spiritual landscapes and looking at the way the Bank of England is established on the profits from the slave trade. And we went in what used to be the Royal Exchange, is now a very upmarket shopping centre, and I'm a fairly scruffy person, I guess. And I wandered in with this friend, and I had my camera, and within 5 seconds we were approached by a security guard who asked us not to take pictures, and he stood beside us for the 10 minutes we were in there, and opened the door for us when we went to leave. So we were clearly not welcome. We weren't suited up businessmen. We were tourists with rucksacks on. So that was a very interesting sense in which that space was being controlled, and the wrong kinds of people were being asked to leave. And in that case, I was one of those. So an interesting experience. So what I want to get on to next is the second area that we've got here is marginalization and power. The first idea we've looked at is that when Luke talks about poverty or the poor, he's also talking about social and physical marginalization. So that's our first thought. There is, however, an additional aspect related to marginalization that is absolutely central to everything, and that is power. And by power, I mean social power, including economic and political power. I mean ideological power, and of course spiritual power, including ideas about demons, powers, and principalities. Let me put an idea to you, which we will then go on to explore, and it's an idea that you may not agree with, but let me put it to you anyway. And it's this, if I can get it up on your screen. Oops, there you go. That in Luke's world, and indeed in our own world, the whole of society is arranged for the benefit of the powerful. That's what I was finding out in central London yesterday. Let's explore this by first going back to Luke 18 to the one character who stands out as different from the other 5, and that is, of course, the rich young ruler. This is a man with power. He is a ruler. He is righteous in that he keeps the law, and he is, quotes, extremely rich. He is, in fact, the archetypal good man, the man apparently blessed of God. Notice that there are no restrictions imposed on him as there are on the other 5 people. No doubt he would have been welcomed into the royal exchange. He has no problem coming to Jesus. It says in the text he's suddenly there right in Jesus' presence. He's not at the back of the crowd like the other 5. And also he has no problem getting into conversation with Jesus. There is no one keeping him out as there are with the other 5 characters. In fact, contrary to the experience of the other 5, when the crowd are shocked that they are allowed to come to Jesus, in this case, in the case of the ruler, the crowd are shocked when Jesus does not seem to receive this man as they expected he would. They say, if not this man, then who can be saved? So the question that I have is, why is it that the rich young ruler does not seem to suffer from all the restrictions and limitations that the other 5 people experience? Why does he seem to have so much influence, confidence and power? In order to see what is going on, we need to understand something of the everyday workings of people's lives in Jesus' day. The pattern of people's daily lives were organized around certain big religious cultural beliefs or systems. And these determined exactly where people could go, what they could do, who they could relate to, what they could eat. In fact, just about every aspect of daily life. For example, one of the basic big religious cultural systems that governed the way people lived was based on the idea of purity. Purity was linked to a person's identity, that is, their sense of status and where they belong. And who they could relate to and what they could do. For example, one of the purity lists lists 14 kinds of people who fall into 5 basic categories. You can see that on your screen there. So you have group 1, which is considered the group of the most pure people. They would be priests, Levites, and full-blooded Israelites. Maybe that reminds you of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Group 2 would consist of illegal children of priests, proselytes, that's converts to Judaism, and then you can see the others down there, those born in adulterous unions, foundlings, the fatherless, etc. So you have, and you notice that right at the end there's other ethnic groups, so groups that are not belonging to the Israelites, which would be referred to as Gentiles, so there is a strong ethnic division within that sense of purity. In addition to this, in addition to these ideas about different groups of people being pure or less pure, the whole land is divided up into a series of zones with the temple at the center, so that where you were permitted to go in the land depended on your level of purity. So for those living in Israel, their whole existence, every aspect of their daily lives, was determined by how pure they were considered. For example, purity determined who you could talk to, what public spaces and buildings you could be in, what rooms in a house you could occupy, what you could eat, and who you could eat with. In addition, there was very little a person could do to change their purity status. There are a number of other cultural religious arrangements that worked alongside these these ideas of purity and determined the way that daily life worked. These were not exclusive to Israel by any means, but applied in different ways to all people groups in the first century. Some of the main ways were these. You have purity that we've mentioned already, male hierarchy and patronage, and the idea of civilized space as well is a very important one. Now there's a huge amount to this, and I've written some titles of books. If you wanted to read it further, here they are. Don't try and write them down now. You have to come back and log onto the webinar and take notes of those later on. They're all a bit dense actually, so I've tried to do a bit of work for you. Oh, let's just go back there. So moving on, there isn't space to look at these separately, so do read those books if you're interested, or drop me an email and we can have a bit of conversation online about it. But one important thing to understand about these religious cultural ideas is that they were just an everyday normal part of life. They were taken for granted and largely unquestioned. being simply understood as the natural order of things, or the way that God had designed the world to work. Sometimes the illustration is used, if you want to think about this, about a fish in water. It's no good trying to explain what water is to a fish. Water is so much part of the life of a fish, it has nothing else to compare it with. And similarly, these ways of living were so much part of people's lives. They were so immersed in them that they went largely unnoticed. So when Jesus comes along and talks to a tax collector and a blind beggar and blesses children, he's not simply being kind to the poor, but he's violating or transgressing what everyone understands as the natural or God-ordained way of doing things. In other words, he is challenging the very structures and powers that govern the everyday lives of people, and also the very same structures that keep the powerful themselves in positions of privilege. I hope I'm not losing you on all of this. Let's think about our own situation. I think at this stage we might think that these things don't go on in our own enlightened 21st century world. But in fact, this is exactly what happens. And like the people of Jesus' day, or like a fish in water, we are so familiar with the way that power shapes and determines our everyday lives that most often we don't notice it. For us, it is simply common sense, the way the world works. The only time when we really notice these things is when someone breaks the rules, as Jesus did in those cases. Let me try and give you a few examples that might help think through these things. There's one woman, Mary Douglas, who wrote in the 60s. She famously wrote about an example of a shoe on a table, which I've got a picture of here for those of you who like pictures. If I take my shoe off whilst I'm eating a meal and put it on the table, it would be considered unclean or disgusting. The shoe wasn't considered disgusting when it was on the floor, and it hasn't become more dirty since being put on the table. What makes it impure is that it is out of place. Mary Douglas argued that groups of people were seen just in this way. As long as they kept their place, they remain invisible or unnoticed. When they are found in the wrong place, they are considered impure. So impurity is not so much about how pure we are, it's about where we are as well. A classic example of this is a view expressed in the New York Times about homeless people sheltering in Grand Central Station. You can see there the comments that some of the comments I picked out that the New York Times makes about these so-called people. The concern, very, very notably here, is not for the poor themselves, but what the paper refers to as filth or droves of bums are in the wrong place. It's not the plight of the poor that is the problem. It is that they are not behaving as they are meant to, but are causing offence by defiling the pure space of the station. They, in other words, should go back to where they belong. Let me just tell you another little local story, one that impressed me very strongly here on our estate a few years ago when we were first moving in. A friend of ours was out late one night waiting for a bus. It was about, I think, 10:30. And as she waited for the bus, two lads came out of the local chip shop with some fish and chips, and they offered Jane some, and they had a friendly conversation. These were two teenage lads in hoodies, so it looked quite threatening. When the bus came along, Jane got on and took a seat, and the lads followed her. But the bus driver challenged them, and they said, "You can't get on this bus with that food. You'll have to get off the bus or leave it behind." As a result, a fight broke out. The lads refused to leave. They threw their food all over the bus. The police came, and it was quite a long time before the bus eventually left. Jane left on the bus, and as she travelled down the bus route, half a mile further down, a man in a suit got on also with a takeaway, and was completely unchallenged by the bus driver. Just sat on. Now, I don't know if the bus driver was very fed up at that point, but I think the point is that depending on how you're perceived will be depending on how you're treated, and that some people, in this case these young men, were excluded, whereas the other executive who walked in with his takeaway was treated with a great more respect. So what am I saying? I am saying that Luke has some strong things to say about Jesus, the kingdom of God, and poverty. He shows us that Jesus not only serves the poor, but perhaps much more importantly, he challenges the very structures that keep people in poverty and destitution by keeping them in a place where they have no power and where they are not noticed. In other words, Jesus offers the poor hope, not by giving them handouts and practical support, but by offering them a whole new identity, and alongside that, a new way of living. I want to go on in a moment and talk about ideas of mission from these thinking, but it would be good maybe to break for another discussion and reflect on ideas that you have and would like to share, or other questions that Stan would like to put there.
Thanks, Mike. This is fascinating. I'm going to get to a question by Paul. He says that the comments that you've been making remind him very much of Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony. Are you familiar with this, and could you make some connections for him?
I'm somewhat familiar with that. Would like to kind of ask a more specific question so that I don't ramble on in ways that are not relevant to the question?
One thing that came to mind, especially here in the United States, that we often use is called racial profiling. And it's often known as for law enforcement in the way that they look at different ethnic and cultural groups, in terms of security, law enforcement. Also, it's been known in terms of economics, lending for, homes, those kind of things. It sounds like there was a lot of profiling in the days of Jesus, and that was just assumed to be okay. And it sounds like we're assuming it's just to be okay today.
It's very interesting to look at some of the sociological studies that have begun to develop in terms of New Testament, the society and the text we see there. So sociological, anthropological studies, and as well as looking at some social geography and geographies of ideas about place. Yes, and seeing that legislation, to organizations of society, and indeed the very way places are built, for example, the way the cities were built, were really all expressions of arrangements of power that were meant to dominate the landscape and dominate culture and society. And the way that they dominated was to keep those who were in the centers of power and could determine legislation and determine how places were built and the meanings that were kind of implicit within them. Those were the way that the society was arranged was precisely to keep those people in power, and as a result keep the mass of people marginalized. And I think those are very intriguing readings of the New Testament. And I think what I'm trying to do here by looking at Luke 18 and 19 is to precisely demonstrate that. The idea that that what Jesus is doing is he's challenging the very structures which are complex in society, but he's doing that in ways which really offer a new hope and a new vision for living.
Add a few more comments to his question. He says that the work is on the way that the powerful elite structure social power in order to sustain their own power. When he's referring to Gramsci's, I hope I pronounced it correct. Would you like to say more?
Yes. Yep, that's helpful. Yep, that's helpful.
Okay.
Not really. No, I think that's a good statement, and I agree with it. I think this is, as I said before, this is kind of an appetizer to some subjects that I would like us very much to be exploring more deeply, and that's partly what Urban Mission, so Urban Life, will be focusing on. I think these are key things for us, and it's very interesting, for us moving to a white estate, which is a marginal place in the city of Bristol, to really have I think, been quite surprised by some of the ways that we have felt excluded, and been making friends with those who also feel excluded, and some of the mechanisms, if you like, the daily mechanisms in society, which when you start to get under the surface of them are shocking. And it boils down to the very, very ordinary things of life, like the accessibility of healthy food, the way that employment is available or not available, even the kinds of ingredients that are put in food and sold to certain kinds of people in certain kinds of areas. So, for example, sugar is a very important commodity economically, and it's often the people at the bottom of society, or those that are marginalised, are targeted with sugar-rich products, and as a result, their health suffers. So what we see here in the West is that chronic illness begins to affect people's lives on average at the age of 46. And when you look at other parts of the city, the average age will be 73. So people in the West are getting illnesses partly through things like diabetes and obesity at the age of 46 that on average are happening at the age of 73 in other places. And that, for me, is part of this idea of, it's part of the, if you like, the structural marginalization that is going on. And it's that kind of structure that I think Jesus is very, very powerfully challenging when he invites these 5 marginalized people into his own presence, and the rich young ruler ends up walking away. There's something very graphic going on there, which is very much more than simply serving the poor. He's challenging, I believe, structures of power.
Jazz shares a couple comments here and asking, have you seen the recent Princeton research about who genuinely has influence in democracy? And it's listed, the link is with BBC. And then there's a quote that she shares, multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. And then quote number 2, in English, the wealthy few move policy while the average American or any Western democracy has little power.
Yep. I mean, so challenging comments, and thank you. It'd be great if I could get those links. Actually, I don't know, Jez, if you could send those to me. But those are, I think, what is I think important to do is to begin to look at some of those issues in the way they affect everyday life. So I think key for my understanding is that it's the way these things work out in daily life, all around us, and the difficulty that we have in seeing them, because we assume that this is the given order of things. And I think one of the interesting things about the way cities are built and the countryside is formed is we tend to think once it's in structured, once it's in places, then that's just naturally how it is. And so we accept it as a given. And I think what Jesus is doing in the way that he approaches people, he violates the given meaning of the places that he inhabits on a daily basis, and somehow finds other ways of inhabiting those. And then by doing that, people cluster around him in ways which would have previously been seen as inconceivable. So I think what I'm really passionate about is, yes, as it were, the big ideas and looking at those, but I'm really interested in how it works out in everyday life, and how ordinary people like ourselves talking this evening might have our eyes open to that, kind of more clearly. And I believe that is, for me, it's part of what it means to be a prophetic church. So the challenge is to see what happens in the everyday and how power is represented in that, and how we might transgress it, and in transgressing and challenging it, bring new hope for a new way of living.
Welcome, David. Makes a comment here. He says, interesting connection between person and place. The offense is not just the poor per se, but the fact that they dare to encroach upon our public space. Broke the taboo, divinely royalty born in a stable. It really, Jesus is living the way in which he came into the world. Yeah. So, into this is reality.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
let's.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very...
One last question here, and then let's
yes,
get
go on,
back to the
Stan.
presentation. Jenny says, could you explain a bit more about food being doctored with sugar? And
there was an interesting article in the Guardian, in the Observer last weekend, which was saying that the World Health Organization wanted to put out guidelines for the consumption of sugar to try and reduce sugar intake, realizing that obesity is now one of the biggest killers around the world. And the US government, I think I'm quoting from the paper correctly, said that if the World Health Organization put those guidelines out, then it would withdraw financial funding for the World Health Organization, because the sugar industry in the States is so important to its economy that it couldn't entertain the thought of reducing sugar intake. It's very interesting to see that a major product of the slave trade, which we were talking about yesterday as we were looking at the financial heart of London, so that we were standing in a place which is probably the most powerful place in the world in terms of its politics and economics and its large corporation that identify with it. And that a major part of the slave trade was a trade in sugar. What made the city rich and the wealth that it's founded on is largely came out of that. One third, I think, of its wealth came from the slave trade, and a large part of that was about sugar production. And so it seems to me that that when you look at the foods that people in marginalized areas, certainly in our state, eat most of, they are microwave meals, they're takeaways, they're fast foods, and those are very heavily loaded with sugar. The drinks that are most often bought around here, things like Coke and Pepsi and that sort of stuff, that have, I think, an average of 14 teaspoonfuls of sugar in each. So there's a huge detrimental effect. And when you talk to local doctors and GPs and look at health analyses of what goes on in white marginal estates in the UK, you find that one of the critical things is alcohol, which itself has a lot of sugar in, but another thing is sugar intake, and the kind of, it's not just the habits that people get into, but it's the fact that they have that it's very difficult to get other kinds of foods. And so, if you like, the whole structure of society, the way that people can shop, the things that they're able to buy is set up so that that people in marginalized areas have poorer health or find it very difficult to get better health. And so these things go very deep, and they are really every day. They're all around us. We see it in our local shops, we see it in our supermarkets, the availability of certain kinds of foods, and the sorts of eating habits that people have got into.
Continue with your presentation. Thank you for...
Thank you. So the last little section, so we've looked at marginalization and poverty. We've thought about marginalization and power. I just wanted to think lastly about marginalization and mission. So how does all of this help us to understand how to participate in the mission of Jesus? Let's go back to Luke 18 and 19 again, because I suggest that the way that the stories are presented make some important points about Jesus' approach to mission. We should note that although the rich young ruler stands in the middle of a string of 6 stories, there is a particular contrast between him and Zacchaeus. Their 2 stories are told in a parallel fashion, and we are meant to notice both the similarities and the differences. One key point of contrast is that whilst the rich young ruler went away sad because he was extremely rich, it says, Zacchaeus became a follower of Jesus, giving away most of his wealth. Without talking about these stories in depth, I want to think about this point of contrast by jumping really straight into some important ideas that I believe are at the heart of things. And I could go back and offer a bit more reasoning, but I will put some statements up, or you've got them here on your screen. First of all, to put it crudely, mission is not about helping people up the social ladder. It's not a story of rags to riches. Luke does not address the problem of marginalization by saying that the marginalized should be brought in from the outside and included on the inside. Neither does he present a vision for serving the poor, which is simply about helping them to be better educated, have a better health, better housing, etc. Luke very specifically does not say about Zacchaeus or the other excluded people in these stories, look, you can become like the rich man. Rather, as Jesus tells the stories of these people, social boundaries and taboos of all kinds are broken so that these once excluded people find free access to the places they seek. They are all brought in from the margins to discover the richness of the kingdom, justice for the woman, blessings for the children, forgiveness for the tax collector, healing for the blind man. And after all of that, the climactic story in the series tells us of Zacchaeus, who despite the crowds who wanted to help him out, who wanted to keep him out, he finds himself brought from the margins into the very presence of Jesus. So that's the first statement, the idea that mission is not about helping people up the social ladder. The second statement that I want to make is that mission is about all kinds of people gathering around Jesus himself. In contrast to the idea of helping the poor climb the social ladder, Luke's vision for the mission of Jesus is that mission is an invitation for people of all kinds, including the rich young ruler, to gather around Jesus himself. The 6 stories present a vision of society in which the marginalized no longer suffer because of their exclusion, but are able to find justice, righteousness, and blessing. And as the stories of the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus in particular make clear, these things are found as people of all kinds are invited to gather around Jesus himself. The shocking element of these stories is, of course, that whilst all the other stories about the five characters are journeys from exclusion to inclusion, the story of the rich ruler is a journey that takes him away from God. Shockingly, he is unable to stay in Jesus' presence or to be a follower. He goes away sad. I believe that the reading of Luke in this way strongly challenges some of our own common mission practices. For example, he challenges approaches to mission that focus primarily on improving conditions of the poor in terms of health, education, employment, etc. It also challenges the thinking that a result of the poor being converted is that they will climb the social ladder. Now, these things are quite dangerous to say. Don't get me wrong. Both of these things are good in themselves, and I've been involved in a lot of those kind of work. Of course, we should serve the disadvantaged in this way, but they are not what Luke is talking about, because they do not challenge or change the status quo, which is inherently unjust and strongly biased towards those in power. In contrast to the model of mission as helping the poor, Luke presents Jesus as inviting people from all parts of the social spectrum to come into his presence. He invites them to be with him where he is in a newly configured way of living. It seems that the very presence of Jesus brings into existence a whole new kind of community, or even a new way of doing society, one that is no longer based on power and privilege, which place you either at the center of the margins, but rather it is relational, centered on relationship with Jesus and, of course, through him to all others who gather around him, whether pure or impure, whether poor, powerful or weak. Of course, one of the problems of gathering around Jesus is you have to come into contact with all the kinds of people maybe perhaps that we don't want to be with, and that's the very point, is that Jesus being the central figure, we find forgiveness and reconciliation with those who are different to us. Let me suggest a simple way of thinking about this. We can think about the structures of society in terms of a pyramid or a circle. If we think about it in terms of a pyramid, with the powerful and the privileged at the top and the poor and the excluded at the bottom. This is this model, poverty is addressed by helping the poor work their way up the pyramid. The problem, however, is the model itself. The higher you get, the less room there is, so that only a small minority of people can occupy the top positions. The whole system then depends on maintaining the excluded majority at the bottom. The mission of Jesus presents a new model, a new way of doing life. We can think about this in terms of a circle. Jesus is at the center of the circle as the one in which the whole arrangement holds together. What dominates this arrangement is no longer the power structures of the pyramid, but Jesus-centered relationships based on love, forgiveness, reconciliation, open-hearted and radical hospitality, and embrace. By establishing a new way of doing things, Jesus challenges and subverts ways of living that keep some people marginalized and offers a vision for a new kind of society and, if you like, a new kind of Jesus-centered space. The practical challenge, therefore, in mission is about what these new kinds of Jesus-centered spaces look like in our own situation or our own city or our town or rural setting. So I want to conclude by presenting maybe a few brief stories that speak of the formation of these new kinds of communities and Jesus spaces. And I would be really interested to see if there are examples as well amongst those who are listening, if you'd like to maybe share a few. The first is a scripture story, which I must mention here, and that is, of course, following from this passage in Luke 18 and 19 is Luke's notable story in Acts chapter 2 as the first fruit of the pouring out of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. People from all kinds of ethnic groups and social classes who would never have been seen in each other's company were now together, quotes, having all things in common, quotes, sharing with all as any had need, quotes, breaking bread and taking their meals together, quotes. What an amazing vision of a new society. And it seems here that Luke is telling us precisely that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in this case results in the structure of a new kind of way of doing things in which the power structures are completely and radically rearranged. In our own community here in South Bristol, we've been looking out for and trying to participate in the emergence of these kinds of new ways of doing things. And we've tried to be attentive to the places where we see these kinds of inclusive communities emerging. One gathering, which is a monthly breakfast, which is hosted by a real variety of people. We have between 60 and 80 people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to eat a big and actually quite unhealthy cooked English breakfast. And it's one of the most eclectic gatherings I'm currently part of. So we start with a simple sung grace. Then breakfast is served, and we have an hour or two to eat breakfast, and then we have a small music group of people who've got together from the breakfast, discover they can play instruments, which we now call the breakfast band, who play a mixture of Christian songs and pop music. And I come back always totally encouraged and challenged. It's really an amazing place to be. And another space that I could talk a bit more about is the space in which we call now the Bread Cafe, and it's a coming together of some of us in the Christian community, a couple of local chefs, and a bunch of friends from the estate. And together we break bread, and it's turned into a small social enterprise. And it's been an incredible sense of people from very diverse social backgrounds coming together, especially the local chefs inviting local people, many of whom have been out of work for 30 years or so, into their kitchen to make bread. So there's been this incredible sense of people coming together and having to get to know each other. And we've moved through some quite difficult potential situations of conflict and tension there. So there's a couple of stories. There's lots more, but maybe it would be good to just move on to a bit of discussion.
Before we get into some questions, I'm going to invite Dan to put up the information. We do have a couple polls here that we would like people to respond to. How helpful was the presentation, and also how well did you like the webinar format that we've used today? And then two, if you would like continuing education units, we have the link there that you can click on, and that will take you to the page where you can fill out the information for the continuing education units. That's CEUs are one of those things for ministry, and so we acknowledge that through Brethren Academy. We have some good exchange here. Jez, I want to make sure I find that question that Jez had. She made a comment. She asked, and then there was a bit of an exchange with her and Paul. Jez asked, "Are we called to work I'm sorry, I'm assuming Jez is a she, and I should not do that. Are we called to work to challenge? What was that, Mike?
No, you might not be right this time,
Okay,
actually.
I apologize.
I
Are
think
we
you might be wrong there,
called to
actually.
challenge power structures
Never mind.
or rescue individuals for them? And Paul responded, church itself colluding with powerful elites can reinforce these exclusions, but then also structuring the questions as either or suggests a particular way of framing power and knowledge in the first place. Are you able to follow with that conversation that went there? Uh, Kind of like, are we to challenge the power structures, or are we to
Um,
rescue individuals from them?
yes. Well, I think a quick answer, if I understand the question rightly, is I think it needs to kind of be both and that that when people of difference come together, as in the Luke story, they're kind of violating the way that things normally happen, and therefore they are challenging power structures. I think as we are involved here in the estate, one of the big questions that we're living with, and I find it quite challenging to answer, is what does hope look like? It's as we form community, as we eat our breakfast together, make bread together, as we sit together. It's very challenging to think about when somebody's long-term unemployed and unlikely to ever to get a job again because of the situation where their relationships are very badly broken, when their health is badly broken, they're unlikely to ever get any healthier. What does hope look like in those kinds of situations? And so it seems to me that that the coming together of a community that discovers hope, that isn't based on, if you like, worldly notions of getting better, but finds something deeper, which is in Jesus himself. That when we live those things together, then we are both challenging power and finding salvation. And I think the critical thing for me is it isn't so much that I have got something to bring to these unfortunate marginalized people, but that as we come together, my own understandings of how the world works are really significantly challenged, and I find that I hold understandings that themselves keep other people marginalised, and keep them excluded, both from my own presence and from in terms of society in general. And so that by coming together with people of difference, we find between ourselves a new understanding arising. And it seems to me that the gospel is that Jesus is found in that kind of connectivity, and that if you like, that revelation or discovery as people of difference come together, and the finding of Jesus through it is both a challenge to the way things are done. It's a challenge to power, but it is also a saving, not just of the person who's marginalised, but it is an ongoing saving of myself in that kind of situation. So I think it isn't possible to say one or the other, but what I do think is important is that as we pursue mission, we don't simply reflect or prop up the systems of power that keep people marginalised. And I think what all the Gospels talk about, and Paul himself as well, is that mission fundamentally challenges the way that society is organised, and the way that it gives preference to those that are in positions of power. And so that to serve the poor, to engage with the poor, must also involve challenging those kinds of things.
Comments that he likes your solution of drawing people into Christ's presence means that both and happens. Sherry, and I appreciate Sherry's remarks. She says, thank you for the triangle and the circle. The triangle as an image of service assumes a top-down and us to them action, where the circle assumes that we all come to Jesus to serve. Serve, washing the feet of one another.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about those two images, and how, what do you find as this most significant of those images impacting the church today?
I think those two images have been, I mean, they're very kind of simple, but they've been very formative for me, and I think for our community here, in thinking about the way that we engage in mission and also engage in community formation. I think it's we're finding, and I have found, that it's very easy simply to work in a hierarchical way, even in sometimes a way we arrange the furniture in our meetings. There's there are people that are given certain kinds of authority and others that kind of are excluded. And so what we're specifically working with is this idea of Jesus-centeredness. What does it look like to have a community that is predicated on Jesus as the center? And so understanding that the presence of Jesus is the critical, and gathering around the presence of Jesus is the critical element for a mission-shaped community, and that therefore communities like that must be communities of embrace. It must be communities of radical hospitality and welcome, and they must be communities that somehow are very attentive to and listening to those whose voices are not normally heard and whose voices I'm habitually unaware of. And so we're trying to develop, if you like, disciplines and spiritual practices, going back to the opening of eyes, which open our eyes and ears to the voices of those and the presence of those who are not normally noticed. And so the idea of gathering around Jesus is if you like, and that's that idea of the circle and all it means to come into Jesus' presence is been very important in terms of our own practical daily lives and our Christian community formation. I think one of the things that's been very intriguing for me is that we have a table, or we eat together a lot, so we have a table as the center of our community, and that is reflective of the communion meal. And so we have we eat together, and then we have bread and wine together. And one of the critical questions I think we need to think more about is whether our feasting and whether our communion is essentially exclusive, whether it keeps people out because they're sinners until they repent, they can't come in and join it, or whether it's essentially inclusive and radically welcoming. And that's quite an interesting conversation, and one that again we are exploring here. But we'd certainly veer towards the wanting to nurture, if you like, a radical hospitality. But at a practical level, daily level on the estate, that's very challenging. We find ourselves not very good at it, and really having to have a lot of our habitual practices and views unpicked by those friends from the local estate who are helping us to see some of these things more deeply.
Well, Eleanor comments that the images offered new insights for her. And then Paul also makes a comment that Christendom reinforced the triangle idea. And so also we want to just say thank you again for attending. Mike, this has been fantastic. The content was just terrific, and want to say thanks to everyone that attended. And I'm going to ask Dan to put up that CEU link once again. And please stay with us if you want to. We do have a couple more comments and questions. Jez writes, do you think we, the Western Church, have a better track record of challenging poverty systems everywhere else, but we don't notice or act in our own countries? That's a great question.
Yeah.
Paul's
good question.
Too.
Yeah. Did you want me to comment on that, Stan? I think the familiarity of our own surroundings often makes us blind, to those kinds of issues, and there's an interesting contrast, I think, to the way that we see those things in other people's and far-off cultures. I often kind of semi-humorously talk about the way that Bristol works. We have a big north-south divide in terms of marginalisation and deprivation, and it's only a 4-mile distance between ourselves and the wealthiest community of Bristol. We can see the churches and their spires from here, and the slightly light-hearted way of looking at that is that more people from those churches have been to Uganda than have been to Null West, certainly to engage in mission. And when I've asked that question amongst audiences and congregations, people to put their hands up. It is indeed true that more people have been to Uganda to do mission than have been to Northwest to do mission, just 4 miles away. And for me, that's a very telling thing. It kind of reflects a lack of awareness of what is going on in our own doorstep. And I think it also reflects, if you like, the anxiety of, well, what if I get involved in a community that's only a few miles away? That might radically change my life. If something's a long way away and I can go and do it for 2 weeks, I can come back to a safe place. But as soon as we start to, like the Good Samaritan on the road there, as soon as we start to engage with those that of difference around us, that are our immediate neighbours, then our eyes are open to things, and there's a radical change that is called for in our daily living. And that's quite a dangerous thing to do. And I would like to reflect on some of that when we get into our next seminar in a few weeks' time about incarnational research methods.
With you in 3 weeks. I believe the date is June 10th. It is a Tuesday, same time, same station. And so we invite you back. Your comment about the communion table reminded me of a church in Washington, D.C., not far from the White House, where it's called Luther Place. And several years ago, as they were in ministry to their community, that they, in a sense, they reappraised what was the purpose of the feast at the table. And when they began to open it up, it also had a dramatic impact on their ability to be in ministry with people in their community. So thank you for that thought. Gordon has a comment. We have a church plant in Northern Ireland full of marginalized people with limited resources, yet find it difficult to get financial support because there is a perception that churches be self-supporting. Would you like to comment on Gordon's statement?
Yes, wow, that's a challenging one. I might have to think about that one, Gordon. It's certainly it's a big issue. I think we find that here in this community of ours. That there is this idea that the church does need to be self-supporting, and we are a self-supporting community. But I think when you think about the wider Christian community across the city, and indeed the wider Christian community across the country, it seems to me that a critical issue is that when you look at estates or bounded parts of the city, that it's about the connections between those places. So on an estate like our own, for example, which is a white ex-working class estate, I call it a estate class. It's very strongly bounded. So there are strong physical boundaries around it. There are strong social and cultural boundaries around it. So it really feels like you're either an insider or outsider. The kind of message that is often received, I think, from the church is, well, you need to get on with a job that's in your place. But if we're going to mix in the way we've been talking about and challenge these, if you like, power structures, then a critical issue is for people to relate across the boundaries, and for us to value the way in which people do that. So, for example, we have a lot of Christians who come and work on the estate as teachers and doctors and social workers and health visitors. And sometimes I think I've tended in the past to think, well, that's not really engaging properly because those people need to move in. But it seems to me to value and to discern and to be attentive to the movement of people in and out of the community is very, very key. And that it's not so much about just sharing wealth, it's about connecting relationally across boundaries that usually keep us apart. And perhaps the sharing of wealth is a part of that. But the sharing of wealth, I think, needs to come out of a sense of deeper connectedness and a sharing of heart, and not just a sponsoring mission financially from the outside. I think we need to get away from those kinds of ideas that churches can just give money. I think it requires a deeper relational connection. And that's what challenges these ideas about unequal relationships of power that exist between different parts of our city. So I think a big conversation, but a very important one for the way that we develop strategically a mission.
Part of what we're talking about, too, is change. How do we change structures? How do we change relationships? How do we change communities? How do we change lives? And at the core of that, at least in some change theory, is that how do we build curiosity so that way we're able to overcome that fear, that frustration, on all sides, that we are able to engage with each other. Um, let's Paul also has a comment. He says Henry Benn's three self model is very Christendom. It's rooted in triangular thinking. Do you want to comment on that, or I'll leave it to you.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy. I'm a good comment. But I'm happy not to. I don't know if Paul wants to ask a question or anything else around that. But I think,
Eleanor
yeah,
says,
good
I
comment.
planted
And
with a
I'll
group
maybe
who are
talk to you
very
later, Paul.
poor and in some despair, am now trying to plant another congregation alongside, in which I hope there will be some people who can perhaps bring in some energy and resources. It feels a bit upside down. Um, would you like to share a comment or a thought with Eleanor?
Um, I guess she's thinking maybe about people who can contribute energy and resources to the other local folk that are there. Without knowing the particularities of that community, I mean, I know that's certainly energy and resources are something that we feel we lack very much in our community here. And the interesting thing that we've been finding, that when you look back over the 80 or 90 years that the estate has existed, one of the things that characterizes it and exacerbates its sense of isolation is the way that energy and resources constantly flow from the outside to the inside. So there's this constant flow of grants and government initiatives and funding and projects that come from the outside of the estate and come to the inside, so that, if you like, the population of the estate has things done to them. And that flow of, if you like, energy and resources that has agendas attached to it. We want to make you better, we want you to eat better food, all those kinds of things, I think has systematically disempowered the community itself. So the use of resources is really a very critical issue. And I think it's more to do with people of difference connecting to each other. So I think would be good to have a conversation with Eleanor about this one-to-one, so that maybe we could tease some of the issues out. But it seems to me that quite a lot of our mission has been predicated on the ideas of, if we can get resources and help from other organisations and get them to put into our estate, then we can get something done. Whereas I think simply we need to make ourselves available to meet with others. And the practices that we've been trying to develop is, as we meet with people of difference, what is the synergy and what emerges from those meetings. And so it's about an attentiveness, if you like, to what the Spirit is doing between us and what emerges between us, and rather steering shy of trying to get resources from outside, if you like. But it's about that kind of relational connection that reconfigures the power, rather than drawing resources from outside that just keeps the arrangements as they always have been. I don't know if I've explained that very well. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there's a critical issue here about the way we engage in mission in areas of marginalisation. And if we're depending too much on resources that are coming from outside without making those deep relational connections, then I think we simply exacerbate, certainly in estates like ours, the patterns that have made the estate marginalised in the first place.
I want to just say thanks again to everyone. We do have Eleanor does make a couple more comments, but we understand if people need to take leave now. We have gone past the hour time. We have some interesting comments and questions coming in, and so we don't want to deny you that opportunity to exchange with Mike. Eleanor writes, intuitively, I feel the relational aspect is crucial. It may be harder than finding grants.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I think the relational aspect is I think it's a very challenging and difficult one to enter into. It is easier to find grants, especially in areas that are marginalised and deprived. We can get grants quite easily around here, but we see that grants have systematically caused the community to become more and more passive and more disempowered, and really can be quite destructive. I know that might be different in Eleanor's situation. I think this is one of the key things about researching our places, which we're going to talk about in the next seminar, is that as we get to know our places better, we will become more sensitized to the kinds of things that we should be participating in, and the kinds of ways that the effects that money and power are having in our community. So I think these are critical issues, and they do differ significantly from one community to the other. So we need to ask some very specific questions about what is going on in our own community, its history, its stories, its narratives, its daily practices, and then think about power and grants and money in the context of those things that we're discovering.
Say we love this, and we're saying exactly the same thing! Exclamation mark and smiles. So, Mike, is there anything that you'd like to say that you've not had a chance to say to this point? You've been terrific.
Thank you, Stan. I think I talked a lot. I think I've sketched out some ideas that are very dear to my heart, and I could talk a great deal further. I hope that for those who've been involved in the webinar, we'll be able to have further conversations. I know some of you fairly well, but I hope that we will have further conversations. And I think one of the main thoughts behind setting up Urban Life as a new organisation is to explore some of these issues in more depth. And so we will be setting up a website soon, and we hope that we have a lot of materials contributed to that and made freely available. We'd like to make stuff available just at very much a ground level, so that teams can engage with where they're at, but also right through to those who are interested in PhD level research. So I wanted this seminar to be a kind of introduction to what I see as some of the key issues. And I hope that the conversation will certainly continue.
Webcast that we have on June 10th, and I trust it's going to be just as great as today. So thanks again, Mike. Appreciate it. And to Dan, who is working in the background, making sure we have all these wonderful arrangements on our screen, so that way we can have the interactive chat and see who's with us, and see Mike and also his slides. Very much appreciate your work, and also to Enton, who helped out but is on vacation. Mike, this has been terrific. Can't say enough, but I'm going to keep you on till the end, so that way as we close things out, we can just have a time to have a little time to debrief. Thank you.
Okay.
So, thanks to everyone that's attending. And
right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have
Thank you, everyone.
A good day, a good evening, or a good afternoon, depending on where you are located. So, blessings to you all.